It is the great Mike Yam. He is found on Sirius XM, Pac-12 Radio as a host. You also see him on NFL Network, has also worked with Pac-12 Networks as the lead studio host for 8 to 9 years. He was at ESPN. You've seen him all over the place, and I don't know how he has time for us here on this podcast. I'm Bryan Fenley, a national anchor at Fox Sports Radio, and this is going to give us an opportunity to look at Mike's career. And to understand someone is to understand their relationships, Mike. And I wanted to start here. You've said your grandfather was your first best friend and that you
Yeah.
think about him every day and that some of the best memories in your life involve him. What are those memories?
Oh man. Well, number one, appreciate you having me on. Two, I didn't know we were coming out of the gates with some high heat, ready to go. It's funny you mentioned my grandfather just because we're doing this over Zoom and got the picture up there and yeah. I look. I mean, I think everyone. I shouldn't say that. I know how lucky and fortunate I am, but I think a lot of people have. Um, family members, friends, just people who just have like this amazing impact. And I've been lucky enough where I've had some great family members who've always been so helpful, mentors in this business, great teachers. So it's not lost on me just how fortunate I am in terms of a lot of the relationships that I've had in my life. And really, to be honest with you, Brian, over the last year, like that has really come into full focus with some of the changes that I've had to deal with and a lot of people have had to deal with in the industry and just sort of in our country. But I think back to my time just with my grandfather, who was like, a huge sports fan growing up as a kid, would come to all my baseball games, my swim meets. Like we would talk baseball. We would listen to, he'd pick me up from school sometimes, or we'd hang out on a weekend and we'd listen to WFAN, which is like the big sports talk radio station in New York City, and obviously ESPN radios now. But back then it was the only ship in town, and we'd always listen to those shows. And I think back. It's tough. I mean, he passed away, years ago, and was battling Alzheimer's, and there's like these moments that stick out sort of in my life from like my childhood of just hanging out with him and just sort of like the great storyteller. He had this like booming voice and would tell me so many stories about his life when he was a kid, and it had a little bit of that vibe when I was younger, that vibe of like, oh, we worked, nonstop, and it was 5 miles in the snow to get to school. It was like stories like that. And he would tell me all the time, these great stories. And I do remember when I had gotten hired at ESPN, and at that point, he was still living with my grandmother at their home. And I had moved, just a town over from them in New Jersey, and I would take them food shopping. So I'd hang out with them pretty frequently. But I still remember the day that I had gotten the call that I was going to get the job at ESPN. And my God, the level of excitement. And I'm not like this loud, rowdy guy. Like that's just not my personality. But I remember the first thing I did was get into the car and I drove to their apartment. I remember just yelling. Like I was just
Oh,
going nuts. Like my grandmother was like thrilled for me. And I just remember my grandfather who, once again was dealing with the Alzheimer's, but like I could see it like in his face. Like he didn't know like what I was happy about, but he saw how happy I was. And even prior to that, like I remember taking him back to my apartment at the time and I don't think it really registered, but I wanted to at least show him some of the shows that I was doing at NBA TV. And I remember putting the DVD in, and he would sit there and it's like, hey, Pop, like that's me, and like we would talk and like, but he would have thought it is really the coolest job. And this, Brian, being in the industry, like we get paid to talk about sports and that's our livelihood. But my God, like I can't even imagine how proud he would have been that I would have had an opportunity like that. And then fast forward all these years while I'm still working professionally, which is still kind of crazy to me sometimes. But that relationship, and I'm rambling here, but it was just insanely meaningful, just beyond words, honestly.
you are not rambling. And when you think about the inner circle of those who have been in your support system, your grandfather, and also your mom, why is
Oh yeah. Yeah.
she your superhero?
Oh, rock star. I've been lucky, man. You know, my mom, she's a university president now, Notre Dame of Maryland, and I couldn't be more proud of the things that she's accomplished in her career. But nowadays, like, moms work, and, like, she had this ability, and I still don't know how she did this. I literally, to this day, Brian, like, it's the
Yeah.
coolest thing I've ever been asked to do. When my mom got the job at Notre Dame, they had said, like, hey, do you want to do the introduction speech for her? And I was completely honored, completely blown away. Like, I was so excited for it because it was really the coolest thing. Like, I was so proud of her, but she legitimately, I mean, she took me to practice, no matter what sport I was playing. She was at the games. I still remember to this day, like, the games that I had when I was in Little League. She would have a pile of papers on her lap. She knew exactly what was happening in the game, but she was still going and working.
Wow.
And it was just like this crazy grind. Even to this day, I know how hard she works, and obviously running a university, during COVID, I know is challenging, and I know that's been hard and draining on her. But I can't imagine having a better influence in my life than my mom. I mean, from a work ethic standpoint, from a compassion standpoint, I had mentioned, you had asked about my grandfather. After my grandfather passed away, my grandmother had a stroke, so she was left side paralyzed. And my mom's an only child, I'm an only child, and I remember, like, we had gone, to their apartment and packing up and, like, doing those types of things. And my grandmother lived at my parents' home for a few years, and at that time I was working at ESPN, which was from northern New Jersey, where I'm from originally, to, basically Bristol, Connecticut. It's about a 2-hour drive. So I would go down on my off days and, like, be there with the physical therapist and kind of, like, cheer her and root her on a little bit. But I think back to what my mom was doing. At that point, she was a provost at St. Peter's University in New Jersey, but she was working a full-time job with major responsibilities, and really was the point person on all the care that my grandmother needed at the time. Like, to this day, I don't know how she was able to manage it. So when you say superhero, my God, like, I don't, it's just another level. Like, I hope I have, the ability to do the things that she did, not only as a parent, but just, big picture, like, how she's able to kind of juggle all these balls up in the air and still kind of hit home runs, to me is just, it's remarkable.
You mentioned that she embodies the grind. So did and does your father, especially what you witnessed and
Yeah.
what he did growing up. What were the sacrifices that you saw him have to undergo that play a part in your own life now?
Yeah. My dad was born in Hong Kong, and sorry, man, it just, a little bit of a rough time now with some of the attacks in the Asian American community. So just immediately, that's like the first thing that I think of. But he was born in Hong Kong, and he came here when he was 16. And I think about sort of his path and his childhood and some of the things that he had to go through. I mean, clearly, China, Hong Kong, like, just, completely oppressive regimes, lack of resources. They didn't have a ton growing up. He just didn't. And at that point, my grandfather was gone for about 10 years. He had gotten a job as a sailor because he heard the boat that was leaving Hong Kong was going to be heading to the United States, and the plan was basically for him not to come back on that boat. And so that's what he did. And that ship had docked in Baltimore, and he didn't go back to the ship. And I guess the technical term now is undocumented immigrant in the country, and that's what he was. And that was hard. I mean, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to not have a dad and, like, a male figure in your life in a country like that, where you just don't have resources. He would tell me, like, it was rice and potatoes a lot for meals, like very little protein a lot of times in their diet. And my grandfather, who was here, I mean, that's a struggle. It's Chinese restaurants, it's cooking, it's cleaning dishes. There's one story my dad told me when I was younger where, authorities had come, and my grandfather would just bolt out the back of the restaurant and, like, hide in the dumpster and do those types of things. And finally, he was able to save up enough money. He got an attorney, his green card, and was able to gain citizenship. And once there was enough, like, he was able to fly my grandmother, my aunts, my uncle, and my dad to the United States. And then they ended up in New York, and he was able to open up his own restaurant. And sort of struggled through that path. And they were robbed multiple times in New York. But I just think the language gap, and I am not Brian, I'm not one of those guys who's got this great skill of being able to absorb different languages and speak. Like, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to not speak English, to come to the United States, to then go to school, navigate those classes. I mean, hell, I had, enough issues in English dealing with that. So the challenges surrounding that. But, you think about work ethic, I'm 39. I think in my life, I can remember my dad taking off work legitimately, like on one hand. I can count it. And, a lot of that was like when his back got thrown out and, he literally couldn't physically get out of bed. It's funny, he still works at a couple of hospitals, but in New York. And when the pandemic hit, thank God now the vaccine's been rolling out, but he was one of the first people to get the vaccine. So he's been vaccinated for a while. And on the second dose, it sort of hit him pretty good. And I remember talking to him and he said, yeah, I didn't go to work. And I was like, whoa, like you didn't go to work? Like that was shocking to me. So I knew it hit him pretty bad. And then there was a snowstorm a week later in northern New Jersey, New York, and it was a ton of snow. Called my dad. I said, hey, you're not going to work, right? He's like, no. I got up at 3 to shovel the driveway. So I had to leave at 4:30 to go to the hospital. I'm thinking, oh my God. So like, I think about that and kind of like the work ethic that my parents have. And I hope I have like a fraction of that. But it's just, in terms of relationships and role models and that sort of thing, like I had sort of like the gold standard, I think.
You did, no question. Mike Yam is with us, Sirius XM host, also with NFL Network and other platforms. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. Mike, how do you use your platform, your voice, to help tolerance with the Asian American community and how it's perceived and what we can do to help everybody get on the same level?
I don't think I do much, Brian. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I've actually thought a lot about it. I don't know if it's a personality thing. I don't know if it's just not something that, occurred to me. Like I was talking to my cousin who lives in New Jersey, and there was like a vigil that, she took my nieces and nephews to, and my aunt and uncle also went. And, I haven't done something like that before. Like I haven't gone to a rally, and those types of things. So when you say platform, like, sure, like, it's easy for me to hit the retweet button or, post a video of like just sheer chaos. I think a lot of people in the Asian American community are still trying to wrap their head around what's happening. Honestly, like this morning I was doing a show on Sirius XM. I was doing Pac-12 radio, and kind of my normal routine. I wake up, I turn on CNBC, get ready, I'm making breakfast, and I'm just kind of going through Twitter to make sure that there's no major stories that I'm missing. And I see another video, and it's a few blocks from where I get my hair cut, and a young woman who probably is like 110 pounds getting tossed like a rag doll as she's getting hit in the face and kind of hanging on to her car and getting flinged out into the middle of the street. And that one hit me, and like it's been hitting me for a while. Like I think about family members that have to go into New York City. And the wild thing is, I've lived now in the Bay Area for almost 10 years. I got here in 2012 when Pac-12 Network was launching. And I think there's always a comfort level of being in a city, for me at least, right? Like I went to school in New York City, I went to Fordham, it was the Bronx, I was born in the Bronx, like worked in Midtown. Like there's this element of diversity, which almost became like second nature to me. But I think about a heavy dose of Asian Americans that live in the Bay Area. And I think what's even sadder is the attacks have been happening. And the more and more research that you do about it, the more, at least I learned, like this has been something that's been going on for a while. And sure, there's an uptick, but I think that community in general doesn't, an older community that was being targeted that aren't necessarily from this country originally, but this is now home and they're citizens and, trying to make a life, for themselves and really for their families. It's not easy for them to report it. I think there's a language gap that's in place there. So there's a lot of nuance to the subject. But I will say this, like, I hope to God that anyone who's seeing anything that's being posted or, just takes a minute to like think about it. I really do think that there is a responsibility that people have in this country to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And I don't think we do that nearly enough. And if we did, the Black Lives Matter movement wouldn't have had to be a real movement. Like this would have been something that was solved decades and ago, and it hasn't really been solved. And I think the Asian American community right now that is being targeted, I mean, this is like I shouldn't even say like, because it's, it's not an analogy. It's the truth. Like, this is domestic terrorism that's happening, and there's like a fear factor that's there. I'm wearing AirPods right now to do this interview with you. I don't leave my home with AirPods now. I'm constantly, if I go to the store, I was in a Walgreens and there was a mirror, and I got jumpy. I mean, it was me. And you just kind of feel different in the stores, and I'd never experienced that before in my life. It's weird. Like, I'm taking a walk on the street, I'm looking back behind me occasionally just to make sure that like no one's coming up against me, because you just don't know what the deal is. And like, that's just not a healthy place to be. That's not what I don't think this country should be. I don't think anyone should feel like they're isolated or being targeted. And right now, that's what's happening to a lot of people in this country, which is just insanely sad.
In this country, there are a lot of talkers. There's not a lot of listeners. And I think if we listened more, we wouldn't be in these situations that we are, because we would actually have that empathy. Mike Yam is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. And, feeling like you're living on edge at times because of what's been going on in the different communities, coupled with everything else that's going on from the social justice and, all the other things that this country is dealing with. And also personally for you, having this change in your life, what has this last year been like for you? And how has it changed you as a person and as a broadcaster?
Wow, Bryan, I think I owe you a copay for this podcast, hanging out with you, especially with the answer that I'm about to give. This has been the most challenging year that I have ever had in my entire life, and it's not close. On a personal side, my time with Pac-12 Network came to an end. And when I tell you like the emotional ups and downs that come with something like that, it's hard to put into words. And the amount of support that I've had from friends and colleagues is just truly, honestly, it's been amazing to me. And you had started this podcast and you were talking about relationships, and I always know, like, they'll tell you, and hopefully there's young broadcasters who are watching this, and like the advice that I would give is like, the business is really small. And I knew that, and people will say that, but I hadn't necessarily experienced it until this year. And the amount of support that comes with like sort of the small community, my God, like I lose my gig at Pac-12, which, to be quite honest with you, I didn't see coming at all. Didn't anticipate that. I thought I'd be there. The rights were up in 2024. I just assumed that I would be there till the end, and hopefully even a longer period of time. So to say heartbroken and disappointed by that is sort of an understatement on kind of how it was all done as well. But, I think days after, all of a sudden, like, I've been working with Sirius Radio for a while. My bosses there are so supportive that I knew I would have at least some sort of work. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I'll be able to pay some bills. And then I had been freelancing with Intel Sports, and, the leadership team there, just top shelf. They weren't going to even use on-air people this season, and they carved out a role for me. And then NFL Network, I had interviewed with those guys, and they didn't have something, but they said, hey, keep in touch. And then right before my contract's supposed to run out, they reach out. And I know that they had contacted people at ESPN, because that was sort of like a connection that I had with the talent director at the time, who then subsequently has left to go to ABC News. But, I know he had reached out to people at ESPN, and like, you just don't know what people say about you. And I know people had vouched for me. So like, I don't even have this work, and it's been amazing. Like, I was just at, it's kind of weird how it comes full circle. Like, last week I was at Stanford to do a pro day for NFL Network. Like, it is crazy to go to a campus that you know well. And I look down at my shirt, I'm like, oh man, it doesn't say Pac-12 Network, it says NFL Network on it now. You're holding that mic flag. It's like, whoa, this is weird. Before I hopped on with you, I was on a call just kind of getting the skinny on UW's pro day, which is next week, which I'll be able to head up to Seattle. Like, I loved heading into those campuses. I loved interacting with a lot of the administrators that were there, who was super kind to me. I didn't think I would be doing it again, though, to be quite honest with you. And then here it is in a 2-week span. I'm at Stanford, I'm at Washington. Hopefully there's more to come. So it's been a tough year, but I think in a lot of ways, like, you grow from it. And I think there's definitely a different level of appreciation that I have for this business, for the craft. Like, I do a lot of hits for NFL Network right here, Bryan. Like, I do radio shows for Sirius. Like, I'm like right here. I miss putting a full suit on. I wear shorts, like 99 100% of the time when I'm inside my apartment. Like I missed those things, and I still remember to this day, Pac-12 Network launched, probably the greatest professional experience I've ever had. Like I remember that night vividly and all the things, but I remember a moment when I got out onto the set and no one was there at that time. And I remember like putting my hand on the desk, thinking to myself, oh man, like this is gonna be home for a while. And it was, almost 9 years, which is just an amazing run for anyone in this business at one network, and super grateful for that time there. But I miss that experience. I miss being on the set. I miss the camaraderie. I mean, we just had the Pac-12 tournament, right, in Vegas, and they were doing the studio shows. Like you sending messages from a couple guys and a bunch of the analysts, and kind of going back and forth on what you're seeing on the video. But like I miss those funny stories. Like, I remember doing basketball shows with Kevin O'Neill and Lamar Hurd and Don McClain. Like we would hang out. Like we'd spend 10, 12 hours in a room with no windows and 8 televisions, and you'd watch all these games. And at the end of the night, you do a 30-minute show. We'd go back into that room and we'd hang out for another half hour, 45 minutes. If Don was there, we'd go back to the hotel and have a glass of wine. But like the point is, like I miss those connections and I miss being around the guys, and I just can't wait. Like I'm trying to get a darn vaccine, which is hard to do right now, but I can't wait to be able to get it and hopefully get some opportunities to be on a set again.
Speaking of people who miss you there, Ashley Adamson does. You know that. I had a chance to interview her and asked her about you. And she mentioned that you picked up the habit of drinking wine while at at Pac-12 Network. So that was something that came. And she talked about how you cover up other people's mistakes, how you're the consummate professional on the air, and how you just make everybody feel comfortable. Now I want to turn it back onto what you think of her. She had some great things to say about you. And what are her strongest attributes and what you miss from working with her on set?
Yeah, super kind of her to say that. And the wine thing is a real deal. You can probably see the decanter that's up there in some wine glasses. We don't have to go into the wine fridge, which is getting a little bit low during COVID. But no, I appreciate her kind words. And I just remember, like, she's going to say, like, I make people comfortable, right? Which is, I appreciate that. But she's got a way to allow people to feel comfortable before an interview. Like I think about some of the stories that she's gotten to cover the last couple of years and how strong of a writer she is. I mean, she does a tremendous job from that perspective. And she's got this great way about telling stories of student athletes and celebrating some of their accomplishments and having people be willing to open up. Like, I think there's one point, she might have even said this to you, but like the Matisse Thybulle story that she did when he was at UW, and to open up about, losing your mother to cancer and the things and the challenges that come with something like that. Like, that's not easy. And not everyone is willing to tell those stories to certain people. So as much as she's going to say, like, I make people comfortable, she's obviously doing very much the same thing. And I will say, like, she's always willing to listen to one of my wine stories, which is always kind of a cool little thing. But it was awesome. And like, I'd mentioned, sort of those relationships at Pac-12. Like I miss working with a lot of the folks over there who were just amazing to me and super supportive over the last year. Like that's the tough thing. I've been, I was at ESPN and certainly have friends that are still there, and NBA TV, still kind of keep in touch with a couple of the folks there, Sirius Radio. And I had never been at a place quite like Pac-12 Network where our crew talks all year. Like Don McClain and Earl Watson and Manny Muehlbach and like all, I shouldn't even just name check because people are going to get mad that I didn't mention that, but it's like a real thing, like it's basketball season. Like yesterday, I left a message for Nigel Burton just to check in and see how he's doing. Like I had never experienced that before. Most of the time, it's like a seasonal thing. You see the guys that you work with in their respective seasons for the sports that they had covered, not like this at Pac-12. So that's like the hardest thing about this. And I hope, to be honest with you, I hope they figure out things on the financial side and the direction of that place, because there's so many talented people inside that building.
Yeah, no question about it. My final question for you, Mike, is you went to Fordham, and I read a story that Keith Olbermann one day spoke at one of your classes, and he laid out these stats about how hard it is to get to his level or to a level in the business where you're on the air and doing sports. How much of a driving force for motivation was that for you to hear that?
It's the scariest conversation I had heard when I was at Fordham. I mean, look, what an unbelievable program. I would never be where I'm at now without the training ground that was Fordham and specifically WFUV and that sports department. I mean, it was phenomenal. The experiences that I had there, from hosting shows to covering teams like pro teams, like I used to cover the Knicks and the Mets. I mean, I got, the Subway Series, you get these credentials for these major sports and you figure out like, hey, what is expected of me? How do I do this job? I always say this, and Bryan, because you work in radio and understand this better than anyone. I've always said, if you can do radio, you can do TV. If you can do TV, you can't always do radio. And that skill set was such a driver for me. But we would have these workshops every week where professionals would come in, critique tapes, give us advice. And it was super valuable because, it wasn't like I was going to medical school. At one point in my life, I thought I would, but, there's a set path to be a doctor. And to be a broadcaster, I mean, you're zigzagging all over the place and there's no set way of doing it. But we would have these pros come in, the Mike Breens of the world, super supportive. And, Dave Sims comes to mind, like just amazing, amazing people. And I remember, I'll never forget the time Keith Olbermann comes in, it's your point, he's telling you how competitive it is. And he had statistics, brilliant mind, Keith Olbermann. He had statistics on why we wouldn't make it in the business. And to this day, like I still remember that talk. I remember walking home from Keening Hall, which is the big building on our campus, back to my dorm room going, oh my God, I was pre-med when I got here, switched to communications. I'm going to have to switch again. I'm not going to have a job. I'm not going to work in this business. And it like freaks you out. And then you realize that, like if you want it to get done, it will get done. Like Fran Charles, I had interviewed or interned at WNBC in New York, and Fran now is an MLB network. And I remember him telling me like, no, man, if you want a job in this industry, it is possible. Like you can make it happen and there's no set path of doing it. And it just reminded me of every single time I go to a college. And when I was in the Pac-12, I got to speak to a lot of broadcast students, which I loved. It was one of my favorite things to do when I was there. But just to be encouraging, because you never know who's really going to make it, who's not. You just know that there's a certain level of dedication and grind. And quite honestly, Bryan, like this, like things kind of need to fall into place for you. And for whatever reason, things fell into place for me. And I'm just insanely fortunate that things had kind of worked out the way that they have in my career. And I had opportunities, and for whatever reason, someone took a liking to me and was willing to listen to my tape and say, hey, don't do this on your reel, do this instead. Or, hey, when you're hosting a show, like think about your transitions. How do you get from topic to topic? You want it to be natural. Don't be so fixated. Don't, listen when you're doing an interview. You don't always have to write out every single question, pay attention to what's happening. Like these little nuggets of information that help form a specific style. And everyone has obviously their own style, but where are we at without our mentors, right? Like where are we at with people who just are willing to care? And I think about the people who have been just good to me in this business, and like just insanely indebted to them.
Well, you've been such a good human being as well back to them. So many wonderful things have been said about you, and that grind, well, that's not in the statistic. See, what Keith didn't include was the grind that you have, the will to want it. There isn't included in that statistic what you were capable of doing, because the amount of work that you wanted to put in to make it happen. And while it's been, like you said, a zigzag path, you have found a way here. And I'm so happy for you being with NFL Network, and then obviously listening to you and the guys with Pac-12 Radio and Sirius XM. And it was fun coming on with you guys
Yeah, it was
a couple
awesome to
days
have
ago
you on the
talking.
other day. Yeah.
Yeah, that was like, I don't know if Mike knows the correlation, because I know we follow each other on Twitter, but it was really fun to chat with you guys, even though I didn't get Guy's joke at the beginning. But then once we got through that, that I was like, oh yeah, okay, I got where you guys are going now. So Mike, thank you so much. This was an honor. You speak about your mentors, and I'm sure your grandfather would be so proud of where your life has turned into what it is today. Thanks so much again. I'm Bryan Fenley.
I appreciate it, Bryan. Thanks again for having me, man. Seriously, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you even asking just sort of about what's been happening in the Asian American community, because it does need to be discussed more. And it's really sad. So hopefully people are starting to pay a little bit more attention to all of this. But seriously, thank you very much.